Have you ever wondered what really happened the moment Moses breathed his last breath? Picture the scene. A quiet mountain peak, the winds of Moab brushing against the rocks, the great prophet gazing into the promised land that he would never enter. For 40 years he led a stubborn, wandering people through deserts, battles, rebellions, and miracles. And now, his story comes to an end on Mount Nebo. But here's the question that rarely gets asked. What happened next? Because when we think of Moses, we usually think of the Red Sea parting, the Ten Commandments, or the plagues of Egypt. We think of the miracles and the mighty confrontations with Pharaoh. Yet the Bible tells us something remarkable. When Moses died, his mission did not die with him. Something shifted in the heavens. A new chapter was written, and it was written with urgency, almost as if God himself was racing against time. The death of Moses was not just the close of a life. It was a closing of a prophetic era, the final line of a generation's story. But it also became the spark of something new, something shocking, something that would move faster than anyone expected. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. Because when one chapter ends, heaven does not go silent. God does not step back and say, well, that's over. No. When Moses' eyes closed, the eyes of an entire nation were open to a fresh destiny. Let's pause and imagine this together. A nation of people standing on the edge of a river. Their leader, the only one they had ever known, is gone. They don't even know where his body lies. The Bible says God himself buried Moses in a valley, and no one has ever found the place. It's as if God wanted to make a statement. Don't look back at the grave. Look ahead to the promise. That mystery of a hidden burial still lingers like a shadow in the text. We know Moses died. We know God buried him. But we don't know where. And maybe that's the point. Because Moses' role was never meant to be a monument. It was a movement. His life was a bridge, not a destination. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn. You might expect the people to spend months in mourning, holding ceremonies, building memorials, or freezing in fear without their great leader. Yet the Bible records none of that. There is no funeral procession, no endless grief, no delay. Instead, what happens is sudden, almost shocking. God speaks, not to Aaron's sons, not to the tribal elders, not to the priests, but directly to Joshua, Moses' assistant. The message is short and direct. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. Go over this Jordan. Do you feel the weight of that? It's as if heaven says, yes, the past was important. Yes, Moses mattered. But the mission continues, and it continues now. And that's where the story becomes deeply personal. Because haven't we all experienced moments where something ended in our lives? A relationship, a job, a dream, even a passing of someone we loved. And in that space, we often expect a long pause, a season where God might let us breathe. But sometimes, instead of silence, God says, get up, move forward. The promise hasn't changed. That's exactly what Israel faced. And what follows in the pages after Moses' death is nothing short of extraordinary. In just a short span of time, 7 major events unfold. Events that shake the nation, shift their faith, and prove that God was not slowing down. If anything, he was accelerating the story. These are not small details. They are moments of divine momentum, shocks that reveal how heaven moves when leadership changes, when old seasons close, and when God pushes his people toward the promise they've been waiting for. So, as we step into this narrative together, I want you to set aside what you think you know about endings, because the death of Moses is not just the end of the leader's life. It's the beginning of divine acceleration. It's the moment when grief meets mission, when mystery meets movement, and when God proves that his promises are never buried with his prophets. In this episode, we're going to explore those moments one by one. 7 events, each one more surprising than the last. Events that reveal how God works in transitions, and how he can turn endings into unstoppable beginnings. So lean in, open your heart, and let's discover together what really happened after Moses died. The 7 shocks after Moses' death. When the voice of God declared, Moses, my servant, is dead, the entire nation trembled. For a moment, it must have felt as if the earth itself stood still. How would they go on? who would lead them into the promise that lay just beyond the Jordan. And then the story takes a surprising turn. This is where the 7 great shocks begin, moments that no one could have fully expected, each shaping the destiny of Israel forever. Shock 1. Joshua is chosen as leader. The first shock came in the form of a name. Not Aaron, the high priest. Not one of Moses' sons. Not one of the elders who had walked with him since Egypt. Instead, the mantle of leadership fell upon Joshua, the assistant of Moses. Joshua had been there from the early days. He was one of the 12 spies, one of only 2 who believed God's promise instead of fearing the giants of Canaan. But still, this was a heavy burden. Imagine standing in Moses' sandals, knowing the eyes of more than 500,000 people are fixed on you. The people must have whispered to each other, "Joshua, can he really take Moses' place? Does he have the wisdom, the courage, the authority?" But God's choice often defies human expectation. And it was here that Joshua first learned the truth. Leadership in God's kingdom is not about being the strongest or the most experienced. It is about being chosen, faithful, and willing to trust the Lord more than yourself. Shock 2, a personal word from God. If Joshua had any doubts, they were answered quickly. God himself spoke directly to him. "Be strong and courageous. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." Think about that. This wasn't just a pep talk. It was the creator of heaven and earth promising his personal presence. Joshua didn't need to imitate Moses. He didn't need to lead the same way. He simply needed to cling to the word of God. And that word was not only for him. It became a message for every generation. That courage flows not from self-confidence, but from God's faithfulness. For Israel, this was a shock of hope. Their future did not rest on Moses' shadow, but on God's unchanging hand. Shock 3. The call to prepare for the Jordan. Next came a command that seemed almost impossible. Get ready to cross the Jordan. The Jordan River was not a gentle stream at this time of year. It was swollen, rushing, a barrier that no human army could cross with families, children, and livestock. To the people, it must have seemed like God was asking them to walk into disaster. But here lies the mystery of faith. God often calls us to step toward what looks impossible. He does not always reveal the miracle in advance. The shock was not just a command. It was the realization that they had to move before they saw the waters part. For the Israelites, this was both terrifying and thrilling. Could God really do again what he had done at the Red Sea? Would Joshua's first act as leader end in disaster or in glory? Shock 4, the miracle of the Jordan River. And then it happened. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant placed their feet in the water, the raging river stopped. It didn't trickle or slow. It piled up far upstream, leaving the riverbed dry. Before their eyes, the impossible became reality. Every man, woman, and child walked across on dry ground. The Ark, the symbol of God's presence, stood in the middle, as if God himself was holding the waters back. For the new generation of Israel, many of whom had not been alive during the Exodus, this was their own Red Sea moment. It was a shock that burned into their memory forever. The God of Moses was also the God of Joshua. Shock 5, stones of remembrance. But God knew how easily people forget miracles. So he commanded something unusual. 12 men, one from each tribe, were to take a stone from the riverbed and build a memorial at Gilgal. Why? So that when future generations asked, "What do these stones mean?" the fathers could tell the story of God's power. This was more than a pile of rocks. It was a sermon in stone, a physical reminder that God's faithfulness was not bound to one leader, one time, or one place. For the people, this was a shock of perspective. Their faith was not just about the present. It was a legacy for their children and their children's children. Shock 6, the encounter with the angel of the Lord. Just when Joshua might have felt confident, another shock came. As he approached Jericho, he saw a man standing with a drawn sword. Instinctively, Joshua challenged him, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The reply shook him to core. "Neither, but as commander of the Lord's army, I have now come." In that instant, Joshua realized something vital. The battle was not about Israel versus Canaan. It was about God's plan versus human resistance. Joshua was not the true commander. He was only a servant of the greater captain. This shock redefined leadership again. Victory would not come from strategy, numbers, or strength, but from submission to the one who commands heaven's hosts. Shock 7, the fall of Jericho. Finally came the most dramatic shock of all. The people were told to march around Jericho silently for 6 days. On the 7th day, they circled the city 7 times. Then, at Joshua's command, the priests blew the trumpets and the people shouted with all their might, and the walls came crashing down. Think of the sheer wonder of it. No battering rams, no siege towers, no weapons of war, only faith, obedience, and the power of God. This was not just a military victory. It was a divine declaration. The God who brings down walls is the same God who lifts up his people. For Israel, this shock cemented their new beginning. They were no longer wanderers. They were conquerors, inheritors of a promise made centuries before. Closing transition. These 7 shocks transformed Israel from a leaderless nation into a people ready to step into destiny. Each moment carried both fear and wonder, both testing and triumph. And through it all, one truth emerged. God's presence, not human strength, was a real foundation of the future. After the shocks of Moses' death, the 7 shocks after Moses' death were not simply history lessons. They were a roadmap, a pattern of how God works when one chapter ends and another begins. Think about it. Israel could have been paralyzed by grief. They could have wandered in circles again, too afraid to step forward. But instead, through these divine surprises, God taught them a greater truth. His promises are not tied to a man, but to himself. Joshua's story is really our story too. Each of us, at some point, stands at the edge of a Jordan River. It may not be water rushing between 2 banks, but it feels just as impossible. A decision we're afraid to make, a step of faith we hesitate to take, a battle that looks unwinnable. And like Israel, we often find ourselves asking, what now? Who will lead us? How can I move forward when what I depended on is gone? The answer, again and again, is God's presence. The God who told Joshua, "Be strong and courageous. I will never leave you nor forsake you," speaks the same to us today. The stones of remembrance remind us that we are part of a story larger than ourselves. The angel of the Lord reminds us that the real commander is not us, but Christ. And the fall of Jericho reminds us that walls, no matter how high, cannot stand against obedience and faith. So, what do we take away from this journey? That endings are not the end. They are the birthplace of new beginnings. Moses may pass, leaders may change, seasons may shift, but God remains faithful. As you listen to these stories, imagine yourself among the people of Israel, standing on the banks of the Jordan, watching the waters part, feeling the ground tremble as Jericho falls, and realizing deep within your soul that the same God is calling you to trust him today. Maybe this is your Jordan moment. Maybe God is inviting you to step forward even when you cannot see the outcome, to believe that his presence is enough, to remember that he is still the commander of the armies of heaven. And just like Israel, if you dare to trust him, you may discover that what feels like the end is only the beginning of your promised land.